So we're probably getting on in time. Is there any last comments or questions that you think would be important that if we were sharing with other people who are interested in, reclaiming science for the movement for transparency, the movement for corporate accountability, the movement for Earth democracy? It's really important that we don't give up the realm of science, even though I don't believe a lot of the conversations we're having are strictly scientific. We believe that we're on the side of science with the perspectives that we have. Is there something you could share with people around the importance of basic science education or being able to work with scientists or speak the language of science to achieving the kinds of things we're seeking to achieve, whether it's reclaimed democracy or it's strictly on the agronomic side of the food conversation, wherever you come out in on that conversation? Based on my experience with you, it seems like there's an advocacy there for greater understanding and embracing the science. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean from what you might call the wreckage of science, right, there's a lot to be salvaged. Mm-hmm. There's that rigorous mindset, which is incredibly valuable, that you don't move the goalpost when you're doing an experiment, that you define your concepts properly. So many people do science in which they say, I'm studying consciousness, and they haven't defined consciousness, right? Or I'm studying this gene, and they haven't defined the gene. Or they're studying this system in which they have, like intelligence, for example. They haven't defined intelligence. I'm doing educational research, and if you don't know what intelligence is, if you're trying to educate people, then what are you trying to educate them for, right? You have to have a rigorous mindset in order to generate understanding. And so science has a lot to offer. If you read carefully the writings of the really good scientists, they have a lot to offer in terms of trying to straighten out people's thinking. And what's happened to science is that for financial, political forces have entered into the discussion and tried to manipulate it in ways that make people think that they're doing science when really they're not, right? So they're trying to control the results of science and use science to manipulate the public mind, but they're not interested in doing the real science. They're not interested in what a real answer would yield. And there are so many examples of this. I hardly know where to start, but there are kernels of truth, but it does require a lot of questioning to get to them. But the simple principles of science are things like an experiment only applies to the subjects that it was done on, right? So let me give you an example. If you test a pharmaceutical on people who are 50 years old and healthy, okay, you do a pharmaceutical trial on those people, and it's all on people in their 50s. So if you then publish that result and you say this pharmaceutical shows that it's good for people, that is an incorrect conclusion, right? What that research really showed is that it's good for people with that particular illness who are between the age of 50 and 60 and also have the socio-economic status that that population had, right? If that doesn't mean that what that experiment doesn't show is that you can then give it to people who are 80 years old or who are children or who have different characteristics than that original population had, because you never did an experiment on that population, right? So there's a very simple way of limiting spotting whether somebody is trying to undermine your understanding or manipulate your understanding of science. If you can ask them what was the original population or what was the original circumstances under which that experiment was done, because anything else is an extrapolation. And the limits of extrapolation are very significant. But, that is an assumption. There's an assumption, right? Between the doing of the experiment and the interpretation of the results, there's always likely to be assumptions. And, your job as a questioning person is to try to figure out what those assumptions are. And so, but scientists don't like to divulge them. Often they haven't even thought about them. But there are also people trying to make sure that those assumptions are never revealed, because then they would undermine whole domains of science. What we think about, when we do a risk assessment, for example, we're doing a risk assessment. It's an ecological risk assessment. We're doing an experiment on a ladybird or a lacewing, and we're extrapolating that to the rest of the natural world and saying this chemical or this GMO is safe for the rest of the natural world. But really, what the experiment was it's safe for this lacewing or this ladybird under these particular circumstances over a 10-day time period that we did. And it has to have been fed that particular food that we were eating and kept under that temperature regime and be of this particular genetic type, right? But if you just did a risk assessment experiment and you laid out all those assumptions, nobody would ever give you money to do it, right? If you explained what it was that your conclusions actually were, all these extrapolations the extrapolations have to be made. The assumptions have to be incorporated in order for the money to be forthcoming, right? So that is often the $1 million question that you can ask scientists. What assumptions went into your interpretation of this experiment? And that will reveal a lot about their motivations and their credibility and the usefulness of their conclusions.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for your time today, Jonathan. It's been awesome, as always,
We've
talking
had
with
fun.
you, and I'm looking forward to tonight.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Great.